Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation on the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this session, our 258th episode, being recorded on Thursday, December 19th, 2019 at 11 a.m. USD Central, we've got Gavin Pickin. And the title here just says Start Doing Integrated Testing. He's got a longer title, but we couldn't fit it on the meetup.com site and also the meetup.com site. One of the challenges I figured out is that the 12 p.m. Eastern, 11 Central, it was just, since I live in Central, it's important for me to start just marking it as 11. So the calendar should work now, but you'll see I start referring to 11 a.m. Central everywhere just to keep it consistent. Okay, and with that, I'll stop sharing and let's turn it over to Gavin. Thanks again for coming on, sir.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Charlie. Now, I'm going to share my screen and we'll see if we get the right screen, because apparently I'm the one with the most screens here. Aha, we got the right screen.
Looking good.
So here's my extra long title, because apparently that's what it takes to get accepted at conferences. So start integrated testing, the biggest and easiest testing bang for your buck. And so you'll see the date here is not today's date. This is the talk that I gave at Adobe CF Summit. I wanted to leave that there so you guys would know that it is the same talk, but obviously every presentation is a little different, so we'll see how that works out for us. Okay, so who am I? Well, I am Gavin Pickin. I've been developing web applications since the late 90s, so it's going on 22 years or something now, working with ColdFusion. I've been a software consultant for the solutions for 4+ years. And what else do you need to know about me? Well, I do a weekly podcast on the CFML News. So if you haven't checked this out, cfmlnews.modernizeordie.io is where you can get all the information about the podcast. We also broadcast live on YouTube every week as well. So if you subscribe to Order Solutions, you can get updates about that. And we do have a CFML Soapbox podcast, which is more interview style that we're doing, and we just do that periodically as we get time with speakers. We're going to try and up that again in the new year, but there's a few episodes out there which are pretty good. I'm on Twitter, I'm on GitHub, and I also blog now and then on my blog, but most of my blog posts lately are on the Order Solutions site. So that's definitely the place to go see if you want to see some blogs. I do have a special announcement, though, about the podcast. Now, we have a special podcast this Monday. We're going to be doing at 3 p.m. Eastern on Monday instead of the Tuesday, the normal time, and we're going to have a special guest, Ben Nadal, helping me present that. So if you guys want to watch live, 3 p.m. Eastern, jump in the YouTube chat, ask Ben some questions, and just start the Christmas week off well. So, okay. So, quick question here. I don't know if you guys know how to use the raise your hand thing, but let's try it. So who's already using testing? Try and raise your hands in there. Okay, so we got a few people raising their hands. Good. Good to see. Usually I do this with an audience and it's easy to see, so I appreciate you guys pushing the little buttons there. But it's a trick question because you're all testing your apps. You just look like this guy. Most of you guys are going to be clicking around the browser yourself or using Postman to hit your APIs or something. So you are testing it. It's just not automated. And so a little bit of a trick question there. But obviously doing testing like this, that's what we're all doing. We're just trying to look at ways to make things better. So this is something we all know, but I'm just going to go over it anyway. Bugs hurt. So the later in the process you find them, the harder they are to fix. If you find something real early in your design, that's, you can change it quickly, but if you wait too long, and you make a change, it can dramatically affect your whole app and basically rot your foundation. So bugs hurt. The other thing is too, if you have testable code or code that is easy to test, it's going to be easier to maintain as well. That's one of the side effects and benefits of testable code. So here's a little diagram here showing you just with the bugs. If you find them in the requirements phase, it takes 1x to fix them. But if you didn't find them until post-release, it's like 10 or 100 times more effort to fix them. Just everything sort of going on all the time required to fix the design, fix the building, fix testing of it, and then releasing it. So bugs hurt, we want to find them as soon as we can. So types of testing, there are a lot of types of testing. You'll hear names like black box, white box, unit testing, integration testing, functional test, system test, end-to-end test. Oh, there's so many more. Basically, there's a lot of different names, and some of them are very similar, but they usually have little teeny tiny differences. And we're not going to worry about too much of them today. We're just going to talk a little bit about unit testing, then integration testing. Obviously, the name implied integration testing. Good, and so we'll talk about that. So the most important types, like I said, for today's especially, is unit testing and integration testing. Unit testing is testing the behavior of individual objects. And so that's, we'll see a definition a little later on, but that's basically testing teeny tiny pieces of your code. So specific functions that you can test, is this little function working the way I want it to work? So it's a small piece of code, maybe just a function in your CFC, something like that. And you just want to make sure that that is working correctly. Integration tests more than one thing to, and how it works together. So a lot of times when you think about integration testing, you're talking about testing the entire application from top down. And so a unit test is one piece. Then testing from top down could mean that you're actually hitting your front end. So you may be hitting, a JavaScript framework that's talking to a ColdFusion API, which is using a database. And so you can test all the different layers. So integration testing is all those different pieces working together. Now, UI verification testing is where you actually verify that HTML or visual elements to your site is actually doing and also looking the way it's supposed to. So a lot of times with integration tests or unit tests, you're making sure that things are working, but it doesn't mean they look right. So someone might have broken messed up a comment, and I've done this plenty of times before, where instead of having, actually a formatter did this just the other day, where if you have a comment and it decides to format your comment and break your comment format up, and it no longer becomes a valid comment, now all your code that you thought was commented out is now on your page. It doesn't break anything, it just looks terrible. So that's what UI verification testing is, looking at. Is does things not only function but also look the way it should? So there's a lot of important testing tools out there. We'll talk about a few of them today, but I just want to give you a list of sort of some of the ones out there. So TestBox, we'll talk a lot about this today. You can run behavioral-driven development and BDD style and MX unit style tests. Your IDE is also important. If you're using CF Builder or Eclipse or VS Code or whatnot, being able to do some testing from your actual IDE is important. A lot of times, if you're doing unit testing, you need to look at something like a mocking framework. We have Mockbox, and I think there's a couple of other ones around for ColdFusion. But there's also stuff for Java, JavaScript as well. Ant is one tool that a lot of people use for their testing, but these days we're working more with CI, so Jenkins, Boom, Bamboo, TeamCity, GitLab, Bitbucket has pipelines, and even GitHub has the actions now. And then Selenium is more of a web driver based test where you can actually test functional things. And then things like JMeter or web stress tools, Apache AB, for actually hitting your site with load and seeing how it behaves under load. So all these are important when you're dealing with testing, just depending on the type of testing you're doing. So what is TestBox? We'll talk about TestBox. This is the main thing we work with in ColdFusion. It's basically a testing framework for ColdFusion that's took over from an old MX unit version that was previously, maintained by other members in the community. They're no longer here. They've moved on to other languages and other areas. But Otis took over and converted it to TestBox. We upgraded and added a BDD, which is behavior-driven development, for a cleaner, more obvious syntax for writing tests. It also has everything else you need to basically work with tests as well. So it has Mockbox, a mocking and stubbing framework, and it also supports MX unit tests as well. So that's what we use, and we'll show you a little bit more about it and how to use it. But it's a great tool, and it's constantly being developed and updated as well as one of Otis's open source projects. So integration tests, as I mentioned before, they test several pieces of the app together. So The big thing about this is that you can get a lot of coverage. So most of the types of tests that we looked at on that first list is some variation of an integrations test. So the black box, white box, etc., all those different tests are different variations of integration testing. And the good thing about it is, although it can include mocks, the integration testing can include full end-to-end tests, which can actually reach out and touch APIs and DBs and whatever as well. Because a lot of times if you're test everything except for the database, and your DBA changed something in the database, it doesn't matter if your test passed for the code. If the database is changed, then everything's going to break. So sometimes integration tests are really important. So what is unit testing? Unit testing is software verification and validation method in which a programmer tests if individual units of source code are fit for use. So it's the smallest testable part of an application. So this is basically in your CFC, say you've got a service or something like that in your code, your CFC has a little function, and maybe it says, is email valid? And maybe that's the code. And so what you do is you'd have a unit test that would test that function. So whenever you're using, an email validation, that this function is going to do what you're supposed to do. And if anyone's tried to validate an email, it's almost impossible because of all the rules for emails. And just the other day, I was trying to do something and I couldn't use one of my new emails because it didn't have a three character extension, or I had too short of a name on the front or whatnot. So there's a lot of different variations, but yeah, so the unit test would be all the different possible variations of what should return true and false in that function are tested. And that way, if someone changes that function, you make sure that it still works the way it's supposed to, and your app behaves the way it should because of that. So unit testing has a lot of pros. So it can improve code quality and give you quick error discovery. If you're running your unit tests all the time and someone did change that email validation function, you'll instantly know if something broke. You don't have to worry about when you go to your browser and try and register for an account that you try every possible combination of email addresses that are in existence that are valid. This is going to give you quick error discovery if something happened to change there. It also gives you the confidence in your code because of that verification. When you make your changes and run your tests, you know that all those edge cases that you've put in there are tested. You don't have to worry about remembering to test everything. They're just there. The other thing with unit testing is it can expose high coupling too. So if your function is using something else, you can instantly tell when you're trying to write the test for it, like, wait a minute, this is reaching out to this other tool. And so if it's not supposed to be talking to that other function or this other code, you'll be able to identify it because you'll see that coupling. And high coupling is not good because you're relying on too much stuff. So we want to basically break it down, and the unit testing will expose that as you write your tests. The other thing it does, when you try and write your tests for writing that function, you want to make sure that you're testing the smallest piece. So if this function is calling 5 other functions, then you're realizing that it's using other things and you're relying on those other things. And so you might have to refactor some of the code for it to be more testable. So you might have to do some mocking or whatnot as well. But the thing is, by going through this process of adding testing, you can make your code more testable. And remember, we said more testable code means more maintainable code. And remember, testing is all about behavior and expectations. So it's doing what you expect it to do. And we're just making sure that it still does that after we make some changes. So let's talk quickly about the styles of testing. So we have TDD versus BDD. And so this is a common picture, and you've probably heard about this over time. And best practices previously said that you must write a test before you write any code for something. And that's sort of the older school method, shall we say, where basically you write the test first, you run them, and they fail. So then you write a function to fulfill that test, and then the test should pass. Then you refactor, and then you sort of continue. And so you'd write a test like, oh, if I call this function, it should return true. And so you write the test, it will fail because there's no function named that. You write the function and return true. Now the test passed. And then you have to do the next test, which would be, if I pass in this value, it will return false. And so you would basically work through and continually upgrade your code. So this is test-driven development, where basically you only write stuff to fix the test. And that's sort of I'd say an older methodology, an older best practice. These days, people are moving more towards a more dynamic setup, but TDD is very popular, and it's sort of like the gold standard. And if you read a lot of Uncle Bob's books and everything, TDD is the way, he works. And yeah. The cool thing about TDD, though, is whenever you refactor, you can do it with confidence, because if you do a test before you write any code, all your code will have tests for it, and therefore you can be confident that the code you've written is tested, and if you change something, it will identify any problems. TDD does focus on the functionality, so it's talking more about, if I pass you this, I will get this back. And so it's more like, what's the function of this? What's the code doing? More than the next step, which we'll talk about, which is BDE. So BDD is behavior-driven development. It's similar to TDD, except for it focuses more on the behavior and the specifications. And so this is more from like a management side of things, where instead of doing, if I pass this email, then it will return valid. If I pass this email, it will return false, which that's more an email validation function, where the behavior here of BDD is more that, when a user gives me a valid email, I get the right result. And so it's more, not deep down functions, but more sort of top level and human understandable. So the big thing with BDD is the specs or the tests are written to be more fluent and readable. And so this makes it great for all levels of testing in the organization. You can take those user stories, essentially, create tests out of them that read just like the user stories. And then when you actually run the test, it looks like the user stories, and the manager could read them and know what the code is testing and what it's actually doing. So if something fails, they know where it failed and why it failed, because it's not meeting this user story, this use case. And these days, it's hard to find TDD examples in JavaScript if you're not using BDD and describe and it blocks, really. So most of the tests you see now, it's moved towards that BDD style, even if they are testing more functionality. The style is definitely picked up, and most tools these days out there are definitely BDD styled. So here's a TDD example for you. So we're testing that the email address must not be blank, and inside a closure we have not equal email something failed. So what's the second parameter in this? Does anybody know? I'll throw it in the chat. It's a little easier with an audience, and I can ask questions in person. Oh, someone's reading. So yeah, so in the top one, we got the email address is the first parameter, and the closure is the second parameter. And in that not equal function, we have email, empty string, and failed. So what's the empty string represent? Yep. So it's a blank. So we're saying if the email is not equal to blank, and if it is, then we give a message of failed. So you can see what it means, but it's not real easy. If someone else was looking through this code, they'd have to double, triple guess, and I sometimes have trouble with those. But here's the BDD example. It's a little more verbose, but it sort of reads more like English. So describe the email address. It should not be blank. I expect email not to be blank. So there's no second guessing here. It's much more readable for me, because I wrote it, but somebody else coming along, you should be able to tell. You kind of ignore the function piece, and everything else is human readable. And then when we run a report on our test, we have described the email address. It should not be blank. Expect email to be. And so if that passes or fails, it should be much easier for someone to read. So let's look at that BDD Matchers. So in that breakdown, we had the first line, expect. So this is just the function that starts it all. So we expect, and we pass in something that we're testing. So we're expecting true, so that's what we're passing in. So this could be a variable or a function call or something that you're testing. So expect true. To be, and that's the matcher. And then true is what we're trying to match it against. So here, if I said expect email not to be blank, then we're expecting the email that was generated or passed in not to be an empty string. So here's an example here with a not to be. So if you have a matcher, like to be is a matcher, we can negate it by adding a dot not in front of it. So we expect true not to be true, and this test would fail. So here's an example of all the other matches. So we have expect true to be true, expect A not to be null. We can expect A to equal 12, expect message to match, and these two matches are actually regex, so you can use regex in your matches, and we'll use some of those in some examples coming up here. We can also look at to be defined, to not be defined. We can say to be struct, to be an array, to be all sorts. There's a lot of different options for matches, and you can make your own matches too. And so Adrian just asked a question: is this similar to Chow and Mocha with Node.js? Yeah, Mocha, Jasmine, Aspect for Ruby, most of these have basically the same code. And we've written test blocks to follow along other best practices. And Jasmine and Aspect, basically, if you write a test for those, like if you're writing something in JavaScript, you could actually almost use the same code in test blocks and it would run. So if you had an API test, and I've done previous presentations about testing your API at CF Summit before, and I've actually used the BDD test where on the front end I'm testing the JavaScript code with the same test that I'm using on the ColdFusion side for the ColdFusion side test. And so the only difference is how I get that variable to be tested. So, but other than that, yeah, the tests can be exactly the same. So BDD is in Mocha and Jasmine and Aspect and a lot of different places. That's the style that basically is the default these days. So here's another BDD example. So we're describing our hello world function. It contains the word world. So we expect when we call the function hello world that the response should contain the answer world. So expect hello world function. It contains the word world. Expect hello world to contain world. So nice and readable, functional, and that whole domain-specific language is trying to make it eloquent and really fluent for you. So I say new BDD example. This is newer. This was actually added by a community member a while back. But think about this: if you have a describe and an it, which is normally what most of these BDD tests are, it can get kind of complicated as you're working through some really complex stuff. So this set of basically it's a language. The DSL has been updated to have more options for you. So in this one here, we're talking about a feature. So the feature is a box size, and I'm going to describe the box. So in order to know what size box I need as a distribution manager, I want to know the volume of the box. So the scenario is if I get the box volume, given I've been entered a width of 20 and a height of 30 and a depth of 40, when I run the calculation, then the result should be 24,000, sorry. And so here, I expect my object at my function 20, 30, 40 to be 24,000. So this type of layout gives you the flexibility to really get in detail. And when your reports are run, they're created in a tree shape where all your box size feature tests are under box size. And then all your descriptions about volumes can all be under that describe. And then you've got different scenarios too. So this basically allows you to format your tests in a way that is really readable to anybody inside the team or outside the team. And then basically you can write your code to match that. And the beauty is if you take a bunch of user stories, they would look similar to this, where you basically have a feature, you've got some scenarios, and then given something, you should return something else. You could actually have all these tests written as you basically work through your stories, and then you run them, and they'll all fail, and then you can go write the functions that actually meet those criteria. So that's the beauty of BDD. Someone taking your basic requirements can, in a way, set up things so then you've got a set of tests to write against. And that way the project manager knows how much of the project is done based on the test coverage and stuff like that. Okay, let's get to actually using some of this here. So we're going to look at installing TestBox. So TestBox installing is thankfully pretty easy because CommandBox makes everything easier. So you could download it yourself and put the TestBox folder in a site, and TestBox runs outside of ColdBox too, just if you want. You can put it in any legacy site. A lot of people run it with Framework 1. I know Sean Caulfield converted all the tests over to Framework 1 before he moved on. And a lot of people using TestBox for everything these days. So you can just download a zip if you want to from the order site, or you can just use command box and just type box install TestBox. So what that does is actually will basically put in a framework folder in your site where all the nuts and bolts of TestBoxes lives. And the next thing we have to do is actually set up our tests folder, which includes the files to run the tests and the tests themselves. So there are templates out there that you can have a look at on GitHub that have all these files for you. But basically, I'm going to show you sort of what some of these files are. So usually what we do is we set up a file called runner.cfm, and we put that in our tests folder. And inside that file, we have a bunch of defaults. So in here, we have things like the reporter, the directory that where our tests live, if we want to recurse, yes or no, if there's any bundles we want to run or labels we want to run. And by default, most of them are just set to these defaults here. And then the bottom of the runner, we include the HTML runner here, which tells it where the testbox runner file is. And so, like I said, in the templates, you just copy paste this, and you'll only change this if you need to change something specifically. Like maybe you don't want to put your tests under the specs folder, maybe you want to put them somewhere else or whatnot. But this runner file basically will go and run all the tests in a folder, and then spit it out into HTML format for you. So let's have a look and see what that looks like. If I can find it. No, it looks like that window's disappeared on me. Okay, well, we'll get to that in a minute here. Okay, they got a picture. There we go. I have a picture in there anyway. So in here we have a picture. This is what the testbox HTML output looks like here. So as you can see, we've got all the test suites and your different files. So it breaks down. You've got 5 bundles, 6 suites, 9 specs. Specs are considered tests. You'll see that you have totals for passes, failures, errors, and if you're skipping or not. If you have Fusion Reactor turned on and your code coverage is actually enabled here, it'll tell you how many files are processed and then what your code coverage is. So you can add some features to that runner.cfm to say, hey, look in this models folder, the services folder, and tell me how much of that code I'm actually testing. And so it'll give you a good example of your test coverage here. You can see here that we have different specs. So registration allows new user to register for the site. Login allows a user to register for the site. Oops, should be to log into the site. Well, there's a typo. But under login here, oops, we have allows the user to see the login page, redirects the user back to the login page on a bad login, allows the user to log into the site. So these are pretty readable, pretty understandable, and that's the idea with these BDD tests. And you'll see there's a debug stream here as well. That means if you actually want to output something, so you want to try and find out why your test isn't passing, you can output things as part of the test, and that way you can look there like a CF dump of all the data that you're looking at your test. So some nice features. The other thing is TestBox also supports additional runners, and basically you can output to a JSON format. So we've seen the HTML one, and this runner basically behind the scenes uses a JSON runner and then sort of formats it. But you can actually change the reporter. So remember in that file we had a reporter and it was set to simple. Well, if we change the reporter to JSON and we actually click this, let's see if my link is still good. Yep, it is. Okay, so in here it says specs 11, total duration, end time coverage. So this is basically all the data. Let me blow it up a little bit just so it's a little more readable. This is all the data that TestBox generates, and then from there we have the HTML reporter. The beauty of this is that it actually will allow you to do whatever you want with it. So if you want to have an app consume it or do something in your continuous integration that does some type of reporting and save files out or whatnot, you can do that as well. So really useful. Okay, so Again, that's just a different reporter. And the beauty of that is that we can actually run test box with command box. Because inside our command box, we output JSON, and the command box command we have will actually let us run those files. So inside of inside of box.json, we have a setting for test box, and by default now, if you just run test box run, it will actually go, if there's nothing in that file, it'll run /test/runner.cfm. And so that'll run on the default site, and it'll run it inside your code. So let me pull this up here. Okay, so here's some code. Here's my terminal. So if I run this box run, it's going to hit that URL. You'll see reporter equals JSON here, verbose equals false. So now what it's done is actually running all my tests inside the console here, right inside of VS Code. I have 11 passed, so many errored, how much time it took, etc. Yeah, so Andrew just asked, no need to specify the running URL anymore? No, you don't have to specify it unless it's different. So by default, it's going to use the current site port test runner CFM. But just so you know, with these runners too, guys, a lot of times I'll set up multiple runners. So runner.cfm will be my default that I want to run all the time. But what you can also do is set up maybe a legacy runner.cfm, which just tests certain legacy pieces of your app or something, or maybe you want to have a runner.cfm that actually points to a different folder, which has a bunch of tests that are really slow. And so you can set up more than one runner. But the default runner is run here. And the cool thing is, if I do test box watch, now it's waiting for me to make a change. Okay, so if I come in here and I say, instead of greater than or less than 100, I say less than or equal to 100. We'll see if this passes. We'll see if we get a nice red failure. Okay, so here you'll see I have a failure. So I have 2 passed, 1 failed. The actual count 3041 is not less than or equal to 100. So I'll change that back, and it's still watching it, and it should regenerate the tests. There you go. So test box watch is a nice feature here. So I'll come back to my code here. So if you want to watch the folders and run tests, test box watch, and there's more information on how to use test box from command box in here. But I like it with VS Code. We just have the right inside of your browser. You can open up a terminal and you can run your tests. If you've got more than one monitor, I usually recommend having a console open in the next window or the browser as well. If you do the browser, you can have it refresh periodically, or just click the F5 when you need to. But having command lines is pretty neat. So I like to see that. Okay, so sort of the demo site for this presentation is we're going to talk about Soapbox for our, it's one of our Twitter clones, and it's actually the app we build step by step in the Order Solutions ColdBox Zero to Hero 2-day bootcamp training. So we usually do these trainings before Into the Box, our conference in Houston in May, and then we do it with CF Summit. India was actually a location that Luis traveled to this year and did the training to, and we've done this at CF Camp before as well. So in here we have a little Twitter clone. You get to rant about things, and then people can fist bump or chocolate ice cream swirly if you really want to as well. So you can positive or negatively affirm those comments, and you can start a new rant, you can view a profile of somebody, they can register, they can log in. So it's just the app we're using for this example, and I'll provide the code at the end of it for you too, so you kind of get to see the result of that training too, which is interesting. But some of you might think, okay, I don't know ColdBox. That's okay, because it's ColdBox, but it's still just a ColdFusion app. So like most ColdFusion apps, it's got CFCs, and we put them in the models folder, and that's where everything lives for our CFCs. And then we have CFM files for views, just like all other ColdFusion apps. And so, yes, it's using ColdBox, but it's not using a whole lot of crazy stuff. And for the things we're doing to test today, it's nothing too special. So don't worry too much. Hopefully, for those who haven't used ColdBox before, it'll show you that it's not as scary as you thought it is. ColdBox is great, or as big as you need it to be, but it's small as well. You can just use it for a simple MVC if you need to. You don't have to use all the bells and whistles just because they're there. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question here. So write your first test. So when you're writing your code, what's the first test you think you should write? Now remember, we're talking the biggest bang for your buck here. So uh, what's the first test you should write? What's the easiest test to write? What's the biggest bang for your buck? What type of test would you write first? Any ideas what you might test? I see someone typing, so hold on. Okay, so Bella said, is the site up? That's actually a very important test. Yep. And then another test, Andrew said, expect true to be false. Yeah, expect true to be false is a good one for if you're wanting to make sure your tests are running. You put that in there first, and then you have to go fix it. So what I recommend, although that is your site up, that's a pretty good one too. Yeah, Andrew says expect true to be false to make sure you do it eventually. Yep, that's a good thing. If you shell out your tests, you basically make a like a template of all the tests you should write. You put those in there, and that means you have to go back and fix them. And when we generate tests for you, a lot of times with test box, we have some scaffolding. A lot of times we'll throw that expect true to be false in there, so you have to go fix it. That way you at least have to touch the test file before you can move on. But what I'm going to recommend for you guys here is the first thing you're doing, if you got a legacy site or something like that, these little tests I'm going to show you is a great way to get started because basically what it does is we're going to check a service. We want to make sure it can compile. And this is what this test does here. So in this case here, we look through all the other stuff and we're describing the rant service, which is one of the services we have. And before each, we're basically going to get a new instance of this rant service. So you could do a new here if you want to get a new object, but we're using Wirebox, so we can use get instance rant service, and it creates a service. And then our test, we're going to say it can be created. So we expect service to be a component. And so what this does, basically, it just creates a variable with it, and if there's any compilation errors in there, it should throw an error. And so by having this test written for every CFC you have, super quick to set up, but now you just made sure that all your CFCs can compile. And to me, that's like a huge win. Like right now, if you have no tests in your app, if you spend maybe half an hour, depending on how many CFCs you have, but in half an hour, you could install TestBox and add a CFC test for each of your tests, for each of your CFCs, and all it does is expects that the CFC can be instantiated, and it returns a component, which a CFC should. Then you just made sure that now your app, anytime someone messes up and leaves a bad comment or, accidentally fell asleep at the keyboard and typed some letters that it shouldn't be, or your cat stood on your keyboard when you weren't looking, now you don't have to worry about pushing that code because it's going to fail the test because there's a compilation error. So I think this is a great first test, and this is usually what I recommend people do to get started because you're learning about how to write a test, you're getting an expectation out there, and it's giving you a lot of bang for your buck. Instead of testing every single function in something, this just makes sure that overall there's no compilation error. So I think that's a big win. I think Bella might have jumped the queue here a little bit because is the side up, it's a good one too. So now we're thinking, should we write some unit tests? So if we just did the rant service and we checked to see if it was actually could be created, so the next test we may want to write is, can we list all users or all rants or whatever you're testing? So here we can expect service.list to be array. So should we write this unit test next? Is that what you think we should do? I'm going to be a sneaky guy here and say this isn't a real test. So expect service.list to be array. This isn't a real unit test because a unit test, you're supposed to mock databases and other things. A unit test should test just that bit of code and nothing else. So this is really more of an integration test. So this here is you're basically testing the list function and everything that it touches to get the data and return it to you. And so again, it's one of those things where, okay, it's not really a unit test, but as an integration test, it gives you a lot more value. So just to let you know, there is a difference there. So why integration tests? Well, integration tests gives you several bits of information. So successful test means that several pieces are working by themselves, because if they didn't work by themselves, then they wouldn't work in a test. But it also means that they're communicating together as well, so that they're working together. So that service list, say I have a service.list, it's probably going to call my DAO layer or ORM layer or something like that. Then it's going to talk to a database, and it's going to return the values back to you. So by running that service.list, I'm actually making sure the service list function works, the DAO function it calls works, the database itself and the SQL that I'm calling works, and then it returns it back to me. So that means that several things are working. And now, by running a test like that, I can cover a large amount of my app because I'm not testing every single function, but I'm covering large amounts of it with that one test. And the cool thing is, as we mentioned before, use case stories or use cases, is that you can test your app's key use cases or user stories. So, as Bella mentioned, a key use case is the homepage loads, right? The site is up. We want the site to be able to come up. And then we also want to make sure that something like the homepage has 3 blog posts on it, because that's what marketing says is the perfect number. We want to make sure that the user can register. The user can log in. The user gets sent back to the login page when the login fails with an error message. The user can add a product to the cart. The user can view the cart. So these may be the key use cases for my app. And now I can write tests that sort of, test these use cases. Now, with a registration, I could test lots of unit tests. I could say, okay, when they register, I have to check to make sure the password's valid. I have to make sure the username is, email address is valid. The email address is not currently in use. I can validate all those different functions that go into registration, or I could just register and make sure that that works. So an integration test, gives you a coverage of a lot of different things, and so it has some big win values and the biggest bang for the buck. And that's why I'm talking about it today, because I think when you're getting started with testing, unit tests are great, but if you're starting an app with maybe 200 CFCs and maybe 1,000 functions, going to add a unit test for all of that would be, a nightmare. It's going to take time. But the key is that you have no test today. If you write some test tomorrow, then you're going to be better off than you were today. And that's the key. We're not all perfect. I could write way more tests than I do, and I should. But the more tests I write, the better things get. And so some of these tests will give you the best way to get you started, and then you can add unit tests as you go. So as you touch some code and edit something, write a test for it. If you add a new function, write a test for it. But some of these will give you the use case coverage that you need to make you feel comfortable and work with your app. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is going to be really hard to read. I've tried to make it as big as possible considering the amount of stuff on there. But basically, this is an integration test for the user viewing the login page. Okay, so we have described the login, and then the it says it allows the user to see the login page. And so we have a CF HTTP call here. So we're going to hit the URL /login with a method of get result of result. Then we're going to do some expectations. We're going to expect the result.status code to be 200 OK. And then after that, that's a user-friendly message. So remember before we had that really ugly message that we couldn't tell what the message was, what the error was? The second item there is basically a user-friendly error message. So if it's not 200 OK, the error should say status code of the login page was not 200. Then we're also going to expect the file content to be a string, because we hit the login page, we want the content coming back to be a string. We're going to check that file content length to be greater than or equal to 100 characters. So we should put a message there saying, comma, and then have a quote saying, the file content should be more than 100 characters, otherwise it's probably an error, or something like that. And then we expect the file content to match. So we're doing a regex match here. So we're just looking for the H4 of the login, and they were basically saying the login header did not appear on the login page, which means we probably didn't hit the login page. And then we can expect the file content not to match the logout button. So we're going to say, okay, if the logout button is on that page, it means we're logged in, so therefore the test didn't pass. We can check to see if the username field is there or the password field is there, because if you're logging in, they should have both of those. So that's sort of an example of an integration test, just to see if you hit this page, what's there. Now for login fail, it gets a little trickier. So describe login. It redirects the user back to the login page on a bad login. So again, we hit the CFHTTP, but this time we're passing a couple of parameters. We're passing a username and a password, and then we're passing that redirect false in the CFHTTP, because with redirects true, CFHTTP will actually follow the redirect and then give you the result of the next page. But we want it to say false so we can see what happened. So we're going to make that HTTP request, and then we expect the result.status code to be 302 found, because when you're redirecting, you should get a 302. And we should always get a 302 here, because if you log in, you should either redirect to the error page or to the My Account page or the home screen. So here we expect the status code to be 302 found, and then on the next line, we're expecting the result response header.location to be /login error equals true, because that's what we do when we have an incorrect login. So we're expecting to see that. If we don't see that, this test will pass. The test will fail. That means that our logout function is not working correctly, or the user login fail is not working correctly. Now we can also test for the user login success. So same thing again. We have an HTTP request, this time with the right username and password, test2, don't share my secrets. Okay, and then we have a status code to be found of 302 found. And then we expect the result.response header.location to be /. So if we're logging in, we should take them back to the main room. Sorry, the main screen. Okay, so should we write an integration test for posting a rant? It's probably a pretty important test, right? When we're looking at being a Twitter clone, if you can't tweet and you can't rant, it's probably a pretty big deal. But what about all of the cookies? Yes, it's getting close to lunchtime, everybody. Cookies. But yeah, so cookies are a big problem, right? Because if you're making CFHTTP recalls and you log in, how do you make an add to rant? Well, you've got to be logged in. And how does the ColdFusion server know if you're logged in or not? You got to pass the right cookies. Which cookies do you need to pass? How do you read them? How do you set them in a CFHTTP request? It's getting a little messy, right? Those tests we're okay. Like this isn't too complicated. It's like 8-10 lines of code to test something. But if we start adding all these cookies and stuff, then it's going to get messy, right? There's got to be an easier way. So with that, I'm going to talk to you about a cool module called Hyper. Eric Peterson built this, and basically Hyper exists to provide a fluent builder experience to HTTP requests and responses. So if any of you have used Axios or something like that for JavaScript, this is basically ColdFusion's version of Axios. So a lot of things are built off of it. And as Andrew Davis said in the chat, he loves Hyper. Yeah, Hyper's awesome. The cool thing about it too is it also provides a powerful way to create clients, builder objects that are pre-configured with defaults like base URL or certain headers. And if you guys have worked with AWS before and you have to pass the same 15 things every time you make a request, or you have to add in certain tokens for authentication, Hyper, you can set that all up. And then all you do is when you use Hyper, you just give it the different pieces. So just the contents of the body or whatnot, and you can have a set of defaults. And you can have multiple of them too. So it works really nice. So I definitely recommend this. It's much easier than dealing with CFHTTP. It's cleaner. It's got that nice fluent style, and definitely recommend using that. So that's an easier way than dealing with CFHTTP. Also, JSoup is an awesome Java HTML parser. So a lot of the tests we're writing were kind of ugly, but JSoup is a Java library for working with real-world HTML, provides convenient API for extracting and manipulating data, especially like DOM, CSS, and jQuery-like methods. So instead of doing that regex match stuff, we could actually use JSoup and say, okay, inside of this element, look for this text, and we could do that. Or look for a button of this class and this ID. And if it exists, it passes, otherwise it fails. So we could do that. But is it easier? We have to, install the Java library, and then we have to write Java in ColdFusion to make it work. So that's easier probably than what some of the stuff we're doing. It'd definitely be better, but there has to be an easier way. And there's a module for that. So let's talk about integrated. So integrated is a test box package for even better integration tests in ColdBox. So start using an easy, fluent API for your integration tests. It's basically built-in JSoup functionality without the pain of Java. And again, thanks to ForgeBox and CommandBox, you can install it by just saying box install integrated. And again, this is written by Eric Peterson, and I think this is based off of something from the Laravel framework, because Eric studies other frameworks and languages and finds the cool stuff and brings them to ColdFusion. So thank you, Eric. So you can find out more about it there at Integrated, and there's a repo and API docs. And because of the older versions of ColdFusion and Java being not as good as they are now, Integrated was built a while ago, and we haven't made a lot of upgrades to it. But after giving this talk at CF Summit, a lot of people came up to me afterwards excited about Integrated and what it can do and what we could build it to do. And so hopefully you guys get a little inspired by this as well. And let's get Integrated working for you, and let's try and make it bigger and better. So there is one thing we need to do with Integrated, is we have to add this Java settings just to make sure we load the paths for those Java libraries. So if you add this to your application CFC and restart your server just to make sure it's picked up, when you install Integrated, it puts it in the root level. So it'd be /integrated/lib is where the Java files exist. And then make sure your tests extend the integrated.basespecs.coldbox-basespec. This just makes sure that all the integrated pieces are working. Everything gets initialized the right way, so when your tests run, it'll work. So this is what you can do with Integrated. So we're going to describe registration. It allows a new user to register for the site. So we're going to say this.visitEvent. So coldbox event registration.new. We're going to visit that event. We're going to see that the title is Soapbox. We're going to see that the words on the page register for Soapbox. We're going to type my test user at autosolutions.com into the form field with the name of email. We're going to type my test user into the form field with name username. I'm going to type, yay, testbox is really cool, especially when it's integrated, into password. Now, we could have done that with JSoup. We could have done that with the response from the CF But now, Integrated does all the hard work for us. We can also write an integration test here to allow to see if users can register for the site. So when we visit the login page, so /login, we can see the title, the HTML title is Soapbox. We can see an element, so we can see login in the element nav. So we have a nav bar, we can see that the login is in the element nav. Don't see an element, start a new rant, so we won't see start a new rant in the element nav. We don't see the button logout. We can type test2 into the username, type test2 into password. We can press the login button. We can see an element that start a rant is now there in the new page on the nav element. We can see the title is still Soapbox. We can see start a new rant, but we can see start a new rant with a special parameter, false, means that we don't want case sensitivity. So if we didn't have that false, then that last C would fail. So start a new rant is case sensitive. Start a new rant, false is not case sensitive. So Integrated allows us to do really simple, fluent, like this is very readable, right? We don't have to guess what we're doing by doing some crazy regex. We can just read this simply, that we're visiting a page and we're just checking titles, making sure there's not a button in the nav bar. Then once we log in, we check that the button in the nav bar now exists, and that's as easy as it is. So what else can you do with Integrated? You can fill out forms. You can type text into text fields, select boxes, check boxes, select radio buttons. You can submit forms. You can visit pages or events, coldbox events. You can click on links in a page. You can check the page that you got redirected to is the right place. You can check for text on a page. You can check for text in an element or in a table, etc. You can also do special things like debugging too. So Integrated can output the debug page, so you can see what page Integrated is actually viewing when you have that function. You can also debug the event, so this will dump out the data from the event, or debug the collection, which is the RC scope. Or you can debug the private collection, the PRC scope. So even though you're using Integrated and this Java behind the scenes to do this test for you, you can actually spit out the information and make sure that it sees what you think it should see. And the cool thing is, too, is that Eric built it to work with ColdBox. But he also built it that you could make your own adapter. So if you wanted to, you could make your own framework adapter. So if there's enough people that want to use this with Framework 1, you guys could build a Framework 1 adapter, and then Integrated could know how Framework 1 works and then work alongside that. The other thing is, too, if you want to use it outside of ColdBox, that it has all this code inside of Integrated, which is open source. So if you want to see how it's doing something, you might be able to pull that out and use a lot of that inside your Framework 1 app or a legacy app without having to worry about using Integrated. As long as you use JSoup, etc. Integrated has all that built in, and so you could, sort of borrow some code from there as well. I'm going to look through some code for a little bit. We're a little short on time, but I am sharing the link here. So this will be where you can get this, and I'll post it on Twitter later as well, so you can go get the code and look through the test. But let's just pull that up real quick so you can see.
Before you get into that,
I'm going to just shrink down my terminal here. Okay.
Could
so
you
this
grab
is the
that URL that you
non-integrated
had
test.
in that slide
Yep.
and just drop it into the chat pod? That will make it a link
Sure.
that everybody could click on and grab. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay. There you go. Okay. So here, this is the one we had, so it's a little bit easier to read from that slide. So describe the login. It allows a user to see the login page. So we have an HTTP call, and we're just checking the result. Check the status code. Check the file content to be a string. We're checking the length of the result of the file content. We're doing some regex matches, not matches, etc. Here's that password test here. So we're checking to make sure if it's a bad login, we redirect to the login page with an error set to true. If it's a good login, then we send them back to the home page. So this is the non-integrated way. And like I said, this is easy and works pretty well for those simpler tests. But once you start getting into the more complicated ones, like having to pass out cookies and logins, etc., then that gets a little trickier. So this one here, so allows users to log in and start a new rant. So up to here, when you log in, this part here, you could do pretty easily on the other side without some options like C and element and etc. They're a little trickier, but right to here when you log in, this is fine. But all these pieces here, JSoup is taking care of the cookies and everything for you to make sure that you're still logged in to be able to continue. And that's where integrated sort of starts to shine. It's just that built-in help. So with the login, I'm actually outputting the debug page here, and I'm outputting it here as well. And that means I can actually see. So let's pull this up real quick here. Just want to show you what that looks like. So here, the login one, okay. So here, so it allows user to log in and start a new rant. So this is the page. So this is giving you what the actual page was. This is what it found. So you've got login here, etc. And then once you've logged in, you'll see that this is different here. There's a lot of different content. And what you could do is just pull it open into online HTML viewer, I think. So that's what it looks like. So once they've actually logged in, they'll see this HTML content. Okay. So it's kind of neat that you can just output that there. So in here, I'm outputting the page. So make sure they see the login page first. And then they check for elements. Don't see the logout button. It's not there. They can click start a rant, but it'll take them to the login page because they're not logged in. And then they can log in. And then once they're logged in, then they'll be able to see the start a rant button. They'll be able to, see all this different stuff. So much cleaner, much cleaner, and much more functional too. So that's what integrated can do for you. Now, we have some tests here, and so this is that sample test for the rant service test. So here, I get an instance of my rant service, and I expect it to be a component. And just so those who are not real familiar with the way this works in ColdBox apps, so models folder, we have the rant service in the model. So by default, Wirebox says if you ask for rant service, and then I have a CFC with the same name inside of the folders I look at, which models is one of them, then it'll open this up. And so here it's it's doing stuff like populator and wirebox, all this dependency injection stuff. But this test makes sure that it can start a service and it is a component without any failures. Now, if I come into my rant service here and I add some weird stuff, you'll see I got an error here. I got a lot of errors because that is now an error in my code. If I go back and save it, my watch is still watching, and it should update here for us. Okay, there we go. All my tests have passed again. So you'll see that this test here, as I mentioned, a simple test, copy paste, change the name of the instance, and if you wanted to do, you could do new models.rant service if you're not using ColdBox and Wirebox, etc. That would work too. You don't have to use Wirebox if you don't want to. But I want Wirebox so I get dependency injection and all the other stuff that I love. But that test there can save you. Trust me. So again, the beauty with this is with ColdBox and integrated in TestBox. If you hook it up to your CI, every time you push code, your continuous integration can show you that your tests are failing, and then that way you know that you're nice and safe. Okay, so let's do a quick overview here at the end. So what do we learn? The simple CFC init test can quickly protect you from compilation errors. Again, I said that's a big win. Integration tests can give you big code coverage quickly. Basically, it can make sure that everything on your homepage works, everything in your login script works. When you register, it works. Those tests can give you the big tests that test key pieces of your app. And CFHTTP works great for some basic integration tests. It's awesome. But Hyper is a module that makes this even easier, and JSoup is a powerful tool. But if you use integrated, it puts it all together for you in a nice, simple, and powerful, fluent DSL. And it's just super clean. So I really like it. Now, if you guys want to see more examples of testing, here I've given you a list of a lot of different sites out there. So there's some from Framework One, some from Order Solutions, some from Foundeo. He's got stuff on his CFDocs. CFDocs has tests, CFML parser, the ToScript, etc. And there's a whole lot of them here. So we got some from Ryan and some from Motorsports. But yeah, so that's my time. Does anybody have any questions? As usual, I'm always trying to jam as much as I can into a short space of time, but
to the mode where you can
guys
focus more on the
that.
questions. And
Happy
while
to
we're
answer
waiting
some
for people to
questions
put
too.
together questions, folks, go ahead and use the evaluations on the right.
Okay, so Donnie asked, do you deploy your tests into production? So our production build scripts remove our test folder. Test box, we usually do box install test box dash dash save dev, which means it only installs on a non-production build. So that way we have no tests available out in production. As part of the build process though, we're using Docker for most of our builds these days. So when we build our master branch, we run our tests first inside of Docker, inside of our build. And we're usually using GitLab these days, but we can do the same in pipelines and Bitbucket or whatnot. So we run our tests and master before we build our image. And when we deploy our image, there's no tests in there. There's no test framework or anything else. But we do test our master branch one more time. No problem, Donnie. Any other questions?
While we wait for Adrian, I'll ask, have you had anybody ask you or talk about using integrated without a framework? Like, so outside of ColdBox, outside of Framework 1, and going through the process you said that one would go through. Have you given any thought or heard anybody give thought to how well it could be used for someone whose code is not in a framework, which of course is sadly very typical for a lot of legacy apps?
Yeah, no one's actually asked that, but maybe because it's working with more cold box stuff in general, and usually when people look, they see it's a cold box one, so they'll just not use it. But I mean, I think the big thing is you just need to set up the adapter to work with um, the data that you're using. So I think the biggest part would be how to visit a page. But we have visit page, which uses the links. So that bit should work. I know that like the event and a lot of those other pieces that Coldbox does as far as the testing, it does a lot of things behind the scenes to help with keeping that information. So there might be a few things that don't work, but I think visiting pages, typing in,
Wow.
seeing a lot of that should all still work the same. To be honest, I haven't tried
Right.
it, and I haven't heard anyone trying it either, because we did, we built it to work with Coldbox, um, but yeah,
Right.
I mean, I
And I get
don't
it that
think it
you
would
hadn't
be
done it
that
as
bad.
far as
But
my
to be honest,
wow
I
was
haven't
that
looked at
nobody
it
else
either.
had
But
asked. But,
I
you're
mean,
probably going to hear
it'd be
mostly from
interesting.
people
I
who
mean,
are
because for
using either Goldbox or some framework. But as you can see, there's been others here chiming in saying they had the same question. So, in that regard, before you answer Jeff's question, do you or anybody listening in have a recommendation, just in case people came to this and got a lot of value, especially out of the first, 70% where you just talked about testing in general, about if someone does have legacy apps, would you have a recommendation of a next best tool if they couldn't leverage integrated?
well, I would definitely throw TestBox in there. I mean, you can use Hyper without Coldbox as well to
There
make
you
your
go.
CFHTTP calls easier. I mean, if they really wanted to, I mean, the matching and reject stuff will do a good job for a lot of things, and I think that's a great way to start. I mean, integrated. Like I said, I haven't looked at legacy apps, but you can actually set up Coldbox um, alongside of alongside of an app. I'm not sure if that would be worth it at this point, but there's basically a little bootstrap piece that you change in the application
And that
CFC
kind
that
of
says,
seems what Jeff was
hey, if
getting
it's
at
one of
there in his
these
next point.
calls, use
Adrian makes a
Coldbox,
good point
otherwise
that
use
could
legacy. And we
discourage
do that a lot
everybody,
of times
although,
with
again, I
legacy
don't think it's
apps.
entirely
And
that
so,
there's no testing that could be done, but I'll let you go ahead and address those various comments and questions.
yeah. Um, and so we just said you could have built a Coldbox app to test other apps. And like, I think that's the interesting point of like if we dual booted, just like you dual boot a computer, we have application CFCs that dual boot our apps, and on legacy apps, that's what we do. Is we, if you hit certain URLs, it'll jump into one thing or another, and so I think the biggest thing for me is I just need to test it. I think it wouldn't be that bad. Um, I don't. I need to go and look into the nuts and bolts of it, but I wonder how much work it would be just to take out the cold box pieces because the event collection and some of that stuff. Because a lot of the functionality should work with just normal URLs. You're visiting a page. That's just hitting a page. And so I think underneath it should work the same. So I didn't write it. Eric did. But I think, that would be the best way. And so let's see. Adrian also said there's a book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, which defined legacy code as code that cannot be tested. And unit testing, you cannot unit test legacy code usually, but integration testing you could. And that's why I like integration testing because, um, yeah, I mean, you can basically just test URLs. I mean, because we've written tests before integrated, where we just use CFHTTP to make requests to pages and make sure certain things are there, and we do certain functions and they work. And I've used CFHTTP to test APIs, and so you can hit your API and make sure when you pass certain things in, it gives you the right stuff out. And so it's not a unit test. Uh, you can test legacy code just like that. And that's my biggest point is that, even in legacy code, you probably have CFCs and you can use those simple tests that I showed you to test them. And then you can add more code around it. But uh, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, everything, as Brett said, that everything except integrated is relevant to legacy apps. And like I said, maybe that can be a little project for me. I'll take a legacy app of ours and see what it takes to get integrated working in it. So maybe I'll see if Eric and I want to have a little hackathon on that sometime, and maybe that's something we could live stream. Actually, that could be kind of fun trying to get it up and running. So, but yeah, I mean, Yeah, I think that's the big thing is, yeah, if you have legacy apps, you can add test box right now and test a lot of it. You could add hyper and make your stuff easier. If you wanted to get into the trickier things, JSoup would work. But I'm gonna talk to Eric about, yeah, looking integrated to see what it would take to work with a legacy app. And if that's not the case, maybe tapping into, adding some Coldbox stuff to make it work alongside of it and see what works there. So I think I'm gonna try that. Yep, Jeff, if we live stream that, we'll definitely alert you on Slack. Yeah, Michael Bourne's been doing a few live streams on Twitch lately, and we've been itching to do something too. It's just trying to figure out what's something relevant for everybody that might get something out of that isn't
And Gavin,
client
if you
work.
thought that maybe could be
We
something
don't
you
want
could
to be
do
obviously
within the
streaming
realm of
some
an
client
hour,
work.
if you wanted to do that,
Yeah, we'll
such a
definitely let
live
everybody
stream,
know.
and have it be
So
something we'd also, run as a meetup thing at the same time, I'd be happy to do that. I don't know. Logistically, I guess I'd have to find out if I could, like, whatever mechanism you would use to do that live stream, would I, within the meetup, be able to show that as something that others could see and hear? So it may not work, but I just want to throw that out there. I'm open to it.
yeah,
And Jeff makes a good point. Yeah, we
yeah,
could do that too.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, might be a way to get more people's attention for sure. So yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting. Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, looks
You're,
like you
you're a
got good
natural
feedback
host.
from everybody, so I appreciate that too. Thanks everybody who attended,
No,
and
you
everybody who's
are.
been really drawn back to get
You're
on.
just taking care of it. I'll just sit back and relax. You're a
Sorry,
natural.
taking your
Yep,
job.
that's exactly what I would have said. Exactly. So thank you for that. And here's some comments from folks maybe just saying thanks, and we'll call it a day. And then I'll stop the recording, and we'll see if maybe there's anybody who wants to ask something off the recording. Good. Yep. You bet. All right. So that looks like
Also, I'm
the
glad
comments
everybody
have
liked
settled
it.
down. So
So
I'll go ahead and
thank you
stop the
guys.
recording. Thank you again, sir.